autism today. And you can go to the next slide. So autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmentally based diagnosis. And what that means is that when someone has features of autism, it is typically something that's affecting how their brain functions and how their brain works and takes in information. It typically occurs early in life. That might be before, like while the baby is still developing in the womb, or it could be after the baby's born. And it often will have some degree of developmental consequences. But as we've said in this series multiple times, how those consequences present themselves can be different from one child, one person to the next. I know, I'm keeping my camera off. I can see that my internet seems a little better. Sorry that I'm not on camera, guys. The two main features of autism, that the characteristics that we see that make this diagnosis into two categories. One is that there are symptoms related to a person's social communication, and the other is that there are behaviors that are a little bit different. Next slide. And that word spectrum is so important, and I really try to emphasize that as much as I can, because the way these characteristics present themselves can vary. They can vary in severity. So you may have someone that has a lot of challenges with communication, or they may have milder differences in how they communicate. They can vary in the number of symptoms that a person has or characteristics that they have. They can change over time. So how a child looks when they're quite young might be different than an autistic person looks when they're an adolescent or young adult, and they can vary between individuals. So that spectrum word is incredibly important when we're talking about these features. Next slide. So as I said, there are two main categories of features that we look at, and these are described in a book called the DSM-5. This is a manual for specialists in mental health and behavioral specialties that helps to kind of guide you in making decisions about whether someone meets criteria. When you don't have a blood test or an X-ray to help you determine a diagnosis, you base it on these criteria. And so there are these two main criteria: deficits in social communication and social interaction, and having behaviors that are restricted, repetitive, or stereotyped. And then the diagnostic manual says that you need to have a certain number of these characteristics in these two categories. The symptoms do need to be something that someone has observed in early childhood, and they do need to be causing some degree of impairment in functioning, and we can talk about what that might mean. And you can't say that someone has autism if all of their symptoms or characteristics could better be explained by a diagnosis of intellectual disability. While some people with autism also have intellectual disability, you have to separate those two things out. Next slide. So we'll go through some of the characteristics of each of these categories. So in thinking about social communication, one of the first criteria is having deficits in social emotional reciprocity. And what does that mean? So that really means that this person has some differences or some abnormalities or difficulties in how they approach social situations. They might have difficulty with back and forth conversations if they are speaking. They might have more trouble sharing their interests, like the little boy that Judy described, where they don't know how to direct other people's attention to the things that interest or excite them. They may have trouble sharing their emotions or showing with their face and their body language how they're feeling. And they may have more difficulty just initiating or responding in a social situation. Next slide. The second social communication category is having difficulty with your nonverbal communication behaviors when you're using them for social interactions. So this is where things like somebody mentioned eye contact earlier in the session, right? So having either completely absent eye contact or avoidant eye contact, but also maybe just inconsistent eye contact, or not being able to integrate your eye contact and your words and your body language in a way that is natural and helps to support how you're communicating with other people. Sometimes people have trouble using nonverbal communication, and sometimes they have trouble understanding or recognizing nonverbal communication from other people. And so either use of nonverbal communication skills or recognition and understanding of others' nonverbal communication, both of those could fit into this category. Next slide. The last social communication symptom looks at your ability to develop and maintain and understand relationships. So in young children, this is really focused on how they play. Do they understand how play works, how toys work, how to be imaginative with friends, how to engage in back and forth play? Are they able to develop friendships that are appropriate for their age level and with other children that are appropriate for their developmental or their age level? And so again, someone with autism may have very limited interest in other children, but they may also be just inconsistent in how they respond or interact with their peers. Next slide. So then moving to the behavior category, there are 4 symptoms under the restricted and repetitive behavior category. The first is having stereotyped or repetitive motor movements or use of objects, or having repetitive or stereotyped speech. So there's lots of things that could fit into this category. Motor stereotypies, this is when people have repetitive movements of their body. It could be hand or finger movements. It could be whole body movements like spinning or rocking. All fit into this category. Being repetitive with objects, so the way Judy was describing Amir flipping the car and spinning the wheels, or for some kids it might be lining up or sorting objects. Being repetitive with your speech. So sometimes as children begin to develop speech, when they've had a delay, sometimes if they have autism, they may have more repetitive use of speech when they do start to talk, or they may have sort of unusual phrases, kind of made up words, or things that they say that don't quite, that wouldn't make sense to the average person. Next slide. The second restricted repetitive behavior is having an insistence on sameness, being inflexible about your routines, or having any ritualized behaviors. So this might be needing to take the same route, or needing to eat the same food, or needing to do things in the same order every single day. I've asked, said to parents, does it need to be done by the same person? What are there things that if a babysitter were to watch your child, you would have to tell them to do this thing because this is the way your child expects it to be done? Sometimes children and people with autism can be really bothered by small changes. The routine changes just a little bit slightly, and it's really troubling to them, or they might have trouble just transitioning from one activity to another, or from one space to another. They might be more rigid in how they think. So they may be, a lot of times children and adults with autism can be a little more concrete, and they may not be as open to sort of creative or more abstract thought. And there may be some rituals that they develop specifically around social interactions, because social interactions can be a little more challenging. So they may develop certain greeting rituals, for example, to help them know how to initiate social play. Next slide. So the third restricted repetitive behavior came up already. Chat comments in the chat. These are when folks have highly restricted or fixated interests that are either abnormal in intensity, abnormal in the type of object. So it could be a very strong attachment or preoccupation with a very unusual object. So I've had children that are very interested in smoke detectors, and they know like all the brands and the models, and they can tell you what features they have, and that would be sort of an unusual interest for a young child to have. Or they might be just incredibly circumscribed and perseverative in that interest. So again, somebody mentioned their child being an expert in their interest, and so they may know more details than any other person would ever think to know about that particular topic. Next slide. The last behavior symptom is having sensitivity to the environment, that is being overly sensitive to things or undersensitive. So you may know someone that has really no reaction when something painful occurs. I've met children where they've had falls or broken a bone, and they don't really seem to even respond to that level of pain, or they may be indifferent to temperature or to some noises. On the end, you may have individuals that are incredibly sensitive to sounds or textures. So it may be food textures, clothing textures, and they may be very bothered by these things, and it can create lots of problems in their day-to-day life. They may be more of a sensory seeking person where they're smelling or they're tasting objects or they're pressing objects up against their skin, or they may have visual fascination with watching things move or watching lights or just inspecting things up very, very close or at different angles. All of these would fit under that sensory category. Next slide. So a question that comes up a lot for me is what level of autism does a child have, or how severe are the autism symptoms? So the levels are designed to sort of categorize how intense these symptoms are or how severe these symptoms are. So there are 3 levels, level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 means that a person requires some support. They have autism symptoms, they meet criteria, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have they need a ton of support in their day-to-day life. Level 2 means that they require a decent amount of support in order to address these social interactions and behavioral symptoms. And then level 3 means that they require a significant amount of support. The functional levels can change over time. So, how much support an individual needs tends to change just with their maturity and their ability to develop and gain skills. But it also can change based on the types of demands that they're in. So for example, Amir in that less structured classroom setting in the home daycare maybe didn't need very much support, but in a more structured setting where there might be more demands placed, he might need more. And how much intervention and how successful those interventions are will help to increase skills, which would potentially lead to less need for support in the future. An individual's outcomes overall are going to be dependent on lots of things, right? So besides the characteristics of autism, a person's cognitive skills, their ability to develop their independence around their daily living skills, the presence of other medical concerns or behavioral health conditions, all of these things can have an impact on overall outcomes for individuals on the spectrum. Next slide. I think it's the last slide. And so I think it's really important to say to families that, the reason that we name this diagnosis is because it is really just describing this person's characteristics. The name itself is just saying this person has these characteristics. It doesn't take anything away, but what it can do, having that autism diagnosis named for a child, is help everyone in that child's life understand them better, understand what supports they might need, understand why they might have a behavior that seems a little bit different. And frankly, having an autism diagnosis can increase access. People talked about Medicaid in the chat. I saw that. So your insurance benefits might increase if you are identified as being on the spectrum. There may be additional educational supports that can be put in place, and behavioral interventions, as mentioned earlier. So those are the reasons that it's important to name it if you see it, and if those features are appropriate. And I think that's the last slide. So I'm looking at time, and I think we have some time for questions. That's right, there are resources. So these are all going to be shared with you. Please don't panic if don't try to write all these things down. These resources are going to be emailed out, but there are websites here that can be helpful for tracking milestones, looking at the symptoms. There are some checklists that are available on these sites as well. And these are some local organizations. So we stuck primarily to the Philadelphia region, so Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, but these are some local resources that families can access also.